When a physician vanishes without a trace, the questions left behind are often more troubling than the disappearance itself. But when that physician was last seen walking through rows of children's beds, checking small wrists for pulses that grew weaker by the day, and when the only witness to his final moments refuses to speak, the silence becomes deafening. What could a doctor discover in those examinations that would make someone ensure he never shared his findings? And why, decades later, would the mere mention of his name cause elderly survivors to close their doors and pull their curtains tight? In 1870, in the heart of Alabama's cotton country, a man arrived seeking truth. What he found would either be buried with him or buried by him. The difference between those two fates may be the most troubling mystery of all. Dr. Harlan Cross first read the letter on a Tuesday morning in late April 1870, sitting at his modest breakfast table in his Boston apartment. The envelope had traveled far. He could tell by the multiple postmarks, the wear on the edges, the slight water stain on one corner that spoke of rain somewhere along its journey from Montgomery, Alabama, to Massachusetts. He recognized the handwriting immediately, though he hadn't seen it in nearly 15 years. Margaret Huxley. The name brought back memories of a different world, a different time. Summer evenings on her father's veranda in Mobile, discussions about poetry and philosophy, the innocent friendship between a young medical student and a merchant's educated daughter. That was 1855, before everything changed. Before the war that tore the country apart and left scars that still hadn't healed. Cross was 42 now, with gray threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of too many long nights and difficult cases. He'd served as a surgeon for the Union Army, seen horrors that still visited him in dreams, performed amputations in field tents while cannons thundered in the distance. After the war, he'd returned to Boston, established a small practice, and tried to rebuild something resembling a normal life. The letter in his hands suggested that normal life was about to be interrupted. He unfolded the paper carefully. Margaret's handwriting was more hurried than he remembered. The letters pressed hard into the page as if written with urgency. Dear Dr. Cross, I hope this letter finds you well, and I hope you'll forgive the presumption of my writing after so many years of silence. I would not reach out unless circumstances were desperate, but I find myself in a situation where I have nowhere else to turn. After the war, I came to Alabama to teach, Alabama too. I believed I could make a difference in the Reconstruction efforts, help the newly freed people build lives for themselves. I've been working at Carver Plantation for the past 3 years, teaching the children of the workers there to read and write. Dr. Cross, something terrible is happening here and no one will listen to me. The children are dying. It started 2 months ago. First it was little Mary, only 7 years old. She grew weak over the course of a week, complained of stomach pains, then died in her mother's arms. Dr. Vaughan from town said it was childhood fever. Then James died, age 9. Same symptoms, same diagnosis. Now 3 more have died, and 5 others are showing the same signs. But here's what troubles me most. All the children who've fallen ill work in the same place, the processing shed where Mr. Carver has implemented what he calls revolutionary new methods for treating cotton seeds. I've tried to speak with him about it, but he dismisses my concerns. I went to Dr. Vaughan myself, but he insists there's no connection, that it's merely unfortunate coincidence. I don't believe in such coincidences, Harlan. Forgive the familiarity, but our old friendship emboldens me. These children are being killed by something, and I fear it's something in that shed. But I have no medical training, no authority, no way to prove what I suspect. I need someone who will look at this with a physician's eye, someone who isn't beholden to Mr. Carver's influence, someone I can trust. You're the only person I know who fits that description. I realize this is asking a great deal. To travel so far, to involve yourself in Southern affairs, when I know your sympathies lay with the Union. But children are dying, and their skin color shouldn't determine whether anyone cares enough to investigate. Please, if there's any chance you can come, I'm begging you. Time is running out. Your old friend, Margaret Huxley. Cross read the letter 3 times, his breakfast growing cold beside him. He thought about his schedule. He had patients who depended on him, appointments already made. He thought about the difficulty of traveling to Alabama, about how unwelcome a northern doctor might be in the heart of the former Confederacy. He thought about the risks. But he also thought about children dying, while adults argued about jurisdiction and influence. He thought about the Hippocratic oath he'd sworn, and he thought about Margaret, who must be truly desperate to reach out after so many years. By noon, he'd made arrangements for another doctor to cover his patients. By evening, he'd packed his medical bag and a small trunk with clothes and supplies. By the next morning, he was on a train heading south, watching the spring landscape roll past his window, wondering what he was walking into. The journey took 4 days. The trains were slower now than before the war, the rails still being repaired in places, the stations showing signs of deterioration and neglect. Cross watched the landscape change as he traveled south. The greening hills of Virginia, the red clay of the Carolinas, finally the flat cotton fields of Alabama. When he changed trains in Atlanta, he noticed how people looked at him. His northern clothes, his bearing, something about him marked him as foreign here. Conversations would quiet when he entered a railway car. Eyes would follow him with a mixture of suspicion and barely concealed hostility. The war might have ended 5 years ago, but here it still lived in people's hearts. Montgomery in May was like walking into a wall of heat and humidity. Cross stepped off the train into afternoon sunshine that felt thick enough to swim through. The station was smaller than he expected, with paint peeling from the walls and gaps in the platform boards. A few porters moved about, but the bustling commerce he remembered from before the war was absent. The city felt diminished, like something vital had been drained from it. He hired a buggy to take him to the boarding house Margaret had mentioned in her letter. A respectable establishment on the edge of town, she'd written, where questions wouldn't be asked about a northern visitor. The driver, an elderly black man with white hair and weathered hands, accepted his money but said little during the ride. The boarding house was a 2-story wooden structure that had seen better days. The owner, Mrs. Patterson, was a thin woman with suspicious eyes who looked Cross over carefully before accepting his payment for a week's lodging. "You're that doctor Miss Huxley was expecting," she said. "It wasn't a question." "I am. She was here yesterday, asked me to watch for you, left a note." Mrs. Patterson produced a sealed envelope from her apron pocket. "Said you should read it before going out to the plantation." Cross took the envelope, thanked her, and climbed the narrow stairs to his room. It was small but clean. A bed, a washstand, a single chair, and a window that looked out onto the dusty street below. He opened the envelope. "Harlan, thank God you've come. I've made arrangements for you to visit the plantation tomorrow. You'll be introduced as a colleague of mine, a teacher from Boston interested in our educational methods. Mr. Carver mustn't know your true purpose. He's already irritated by my questions about the children, and if he knew I'd brought in a doctor specifically to investigate, he'd never allow you access. I'll meet you at the plantation at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. We'll have to be extremely careful. I'll explain everything when I see you. Destroy this letter after reading, M." Cross held the paper over the lamp on the bedside table, watching it curl and blacken, Margaret's words disappearing into ash. He was already being drawn into deception, into a web of secrets and carefully maintained lies. It made him uncomfortable, but he understood the necessity. If Carver Plantation was the source of what was killing the children, then Silas Carver himself might be complicit, whether through knowledge or negligence. Either way, a direct approach would only result in Cross being turned away. He spent the evening walking through Montgomery, getting a feel for the town. The grand buildings from before the war still stood, but many showed signs of neglect. Windows were broken and not repaired. Paint had faded and peeled. Gardens had grown wild. But there were also signs of life returning, shops reopening, people going about their business, children playing in the streets. He stopped at a small restaurant for dinner and overheard conversations at nearby tables. Talk of cotton prices, of labor difficulties, of the hated Reconstruction government. One man complained loudly about uppity freedmen who don't know their place, and Cross had to force himself to eat calmly, to not react, to remember he was here for a specific purpose and couldn't afford to draw attention to himself. After dinner, he found a small library still operating in what had been a church. The librarian, a young woman with kind eyes, helped him find back issues of the local newspaper. He spent 2 hours reading, learning about the area, about Carver Plantation and its owner. Silas Carver was 48, a widower who'd inherited his plantation from his father in 1859, just 2 years before the war began. He'd served briefly as a major in the Confederate Army, but had been discharged due to injury in 1862 and returned to manage his land. Unlike many plantation owners who'd been ruined by the war and the end of slavery, Carver had apparently adapted quickly to the new reality. He now employed his former slaves as tenant farmers and workers, paying them in scrip redeemable at the plantation store, a system that kept workers perpetually in debt and unable to leave. The newspaper portrayed him as a pillar of the community, an innovator who was helping the South rebuild. There was an article from 3 months ago about new agricultural methods he was implementing. Cross read it carefully. Mr. Silas Carver of Carver Plantation has installed modern equipment for processing cotton seeds, utilizing advanced chemical treatments to prevent spoilage and pest infestation. This innovative approach has drawn interest from agricultural experts across the state and promises to revolutionize cotton production. Mr. Carver states that his new methods have increased his output by 40% while reducing losses to insects and decay. Chemical treatments. Cross's medical training immediately raised flags. He knew that many industrial processes used dangerous substances, arsenic compounds, lead solutions, mercury preparations. If improperly handled, if workers were exposed without protection or understanding of the risks, such treatments could be deadly. He left the library as it closed at 8 o'clock and walked back to the boarding house through streets growing dark. Oil lamps were being lit in windows. Somewhere in the distance, he heard singing, spirituals, the haunting melodies that had come from slave churches and persisted in the freedmen's communities. The sound was beautiful and heartbreaking all at once. That night, Cross lay awake in his narrow bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the southern night. Crickets and nightbirds, the occasional bark of a dog, footsteps on the wooden sidewalk below. He thought about the children dying slow deaths while their parents watched helplessly. He thought about Margaret, alone in her determination to help them. And he thought about what he might find tomorrow when he finally saw Carver Plantation for himself. Cross rose before dawn and ate a simple breakfast of grits and ham that Mrs. Patterson served without conversation. He dressed carefully in his most conservative clothes, dark trousers, white shirt, simple vest. Nothing that would mark him as pretentious or overly northern. He packed his medical bag carefully, hiding his stethoscope and other instruments beneath books and papers that would support his cover as a teacher. He'd arranged to rent a horse from the livery stable, and by 8 o'clock he was riding out of Montgomery on the road Margaret had described. The morning was already warm, promising another sweltering day. The road wound through countryside that must have been beautiful before the war. Rolling hills, stands of pine and oak, fields that had once been productive. Now many of the fields lay fallow or were only partially cultivated. He passed several abandoned houses, their windows empty like blind eyes, their porches sagging. He also passed workers in the fields, men, women, and children working with hoes and shovels, beginning their day's labor. They looked up as he rode by, faces carefully neutral, showing nothing of what they might think about a well-dressed white man riding past while they worked. Carver Plantation announced itself from a distance. Unlike many of the properties he'd passed, this one showed no signs of neglect. The fences were maintained, the fields were fully cultivated, and as he crested a hill, he saw the main house rising in the distance. A grand white structure with tall columns surrounded by oak trees. It looked almost exactly as it must have before the war, preserved like a monument to the old order. But as Cross rode closer, he began to see beyond the impressive facade. Behind the main house, spreading across the landscape, were the workers' quarters. Dozens of small cabins arranged in rows, basic structures that looked barely weatherproof. Beyond those were various outbuildings, barns, storage sheds, and what must be the processing shed Margaret had mentioned. A long, low building with a brick chimney rising from one end. Margaret was waiting for him at the split in the road that led either to the main house or to the workers' area. She stood beside a small cart, dressed in a simple grey dress, her face shaded by a broad-brimmed hat. When she saw him, she raised a hand in greeting. Cross dismounted and approached her. She was thinner than he remembered, with fine lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before. But her eyes were the same, intelligent and determined. "Harlan," she said softly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "I cannot tell you how grateful I am that you came." "Your letter was quite persuasive," Cross replied. "Tell me everything, but tell me quickly, before we're in anyone's sight." Margaret's words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back for too long. 3 children died in April, Mary, James, and little Daniel. 2 more died last week, Sarah and Thomas's sister Anna. 5 more are sick now with the same symptoms: weakness, stomach pain, vomiting, and this strange discoloration of the skin. The local doctor insists it's just various childhood ailments, but Harlan, I've seen enough to know it's all the same thing. And every single one of them works in the processing shed. What exactly do they do in that shed? They process cotton seeds, sorting, treating, packaging them for sale. Mr. Carver says he's using a new chemical solution that makes the seeds resistant to insects and mold. He's very secretive about the exact process, calls it a proprietary method. But whatever it is, I think it's poisoning the children. Have you been inside? Once, briefly, when I first arrived at the plantation, I remember the smell. Chemical, harsh. It made my eyes water. Mr. Carver gave me a quick tour, showed me how efficiently the children worked, then ushered me out. I haven't been allowed back since. He says it's for safety reasons, that the chemicals might damage women's constitutions. Her voice carried bitter irony. Cross nodded, filing away the information. And Mr. Carver himself? What kind of man is he? Intelligent, calculating. He presents himself as a progressive employer, better than most in the area. He pays wages, though they're paid in scrip only good at his store, which charges inflated prices. He allows me to teach the children, which many planters don't. He speaks about the importance of helping the freedmen adjust to their new lives. She paused. But underneath the pleasant words there's iron. He expects absolute obedience. Workers who complain too much find themselves dismissed, which means evicted from their homes with no references, no way to find work elsewhere. Everyone here is afraid of him. And what will he think of me? I've told him you're a colleague from Boston, interested in our educational efforts in the South. He was pleased by that. Likes the idea of Northern approval of his methods. You'll need to flatter him, I'm afraid. Let him show off his operation. He has considerable pride. Cross remounted his horse, and Margaret climbed back onto her cart. Together they continued toward the plantation, but now they rode in silence, playing their roles as simple teacher and visiting colleague. As they approached the main house, a man emerged onto the front porch. Even from a distance, Cross could feel the force of his presence. Silas Carver was tall and broad-shouldered, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. He wore well-tailored clothes despite the heat, and his beard was perfectly trimmed. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching their approach with eyes that seemed to take in every detail. "Miss Huxley," Carver called out as they drew near. His voice was deep and cultured, with the distinctive accent of the educated South. "And this must be our visitor from Boston." Cross dismounted and approached the porch, extending his hand. "Dr. Harlan Cross, sir, though I'm here in my capacity as an educator rather than a physician. Miss Huxley has told me impressive things about your operation here." Carver's handshake was firm, his eyes sharp as they studied Cross. A doctor turned teacher. An interesting transformation. The war changes us all, Mr. Carver. I found I had a calling to help rebuild through education rather than continuing in medical practice. The lie came more easily than Cross expected. Miss Huxley's letters about her work here inspired me to see for myself how the South is approaching the education of the freedmen. "You'll find we're quite progressive here," Carver said with obvious pride. "Unlike some planters who resist the new order, I've embraced it. I pay wages, I allow education, I'm implementing modern methods that will make this plantation profitable in a way that benefits everyone." He gestured broadly. "Come, let me show you what we've built here." The next hour was a carefully choreographed tour. Carver walked them through the grounds, pointing out improvements he'd made, workers he'd helped find employment, fields that were producing better than before the war. Cross played his part, asking interested questions, taking notes in a small book as if documenting educational approaches. But his eyes were those of a physician, trained to observe. He watched the workers they passed, noted the thinness of many, the worn-out clothes, the wariness in their eyes when Carver approached. He saw children who should have been in school working in the fields instead. He noticed that while Carver spoke about fair wages, there was no actual money changing hands, only tallies marked in a ledger book. Finally, inevitably, they approached the processing shed. "This is the heart of my operation," Carver announced with unmistakable pride. "My innovation that's putting Carver Plantation at the forefront of modern agriculture." The shed was larger up close than it had appeared from a distance. The walls were solid wood, darkened by weather and time. There were a few small windows set high in the walls, and Cross noted immediately that they were all closed despite the heat. The door was heavy, with a substantial lock. "I employ mostly children here," Carver explained. "Not because I wish to exploit youth, you understand, but because the work requires small, nimble fingers, and the wages they earn help support their families." He produced a key and unlocked the door. "The chemicals we use are quite valuable, so security is necessary." Cross's heart beat faster as the door swung open. This was it. This was where the children were dying. The smell hit him first. Even before his eyes adjusted to the dimmer interior, his nose caught the sharp chemical odor that Margaret had described. It was familiar, troublingly familiar. He'd smelled variations of it in military facilities, in factories, in places where dangerous substances were used. Inside, the shed was dim despite the mid-morning sun. The few windows provided minimal light, and oil lamps burned at intervals along the walls. The air was thick and close, heavy with heat and chemical vapor. Along one wall stood large metal tanks, their surfaces dark and pitted. Along the other were long tables where children sat working. Cross counted quickly. 14 children, ranging in age from perhaps 6 to 13. They were sorting cotton seeds, placing them in baskets, then transferring the baskets to the tanks. Other children were pulling dried seeds from different containers and packaging them in cloth sacks. Their movements were methodical, practiced, but Cross noticed immediately that several of them moved sluggishly, as if exhausted. "The process is straightforward," Carver explained, leading them between the tables. "The seeds are sorted for quality, then immersed in my treatment solution for precisely 3 hours. After draining, they're dried on these racks, then packaged for sale. The chemical treatment prevents insect infestation and fungal growth, meaning farmers can store seeds for months without loss." "What exactly is the treatment solution?" Cross asked, keeping his tone casual, merely interested. "A proprietary mixture," Carver replied smoothly. "Trade secret, you understand. But I can tell you it's completely safe. Approved by the State Agriculture Bureau." Cross moved closer to one of the tanks. The metal was corroded in places, a green-gray patina that made his stomach tighten. He recognized that kind of corrosion. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the tank. "Of course, but don't get too close. The vapors can be quite harsh." Cross leaned over the tank carefully. The liquid inside was dark, with an oily sheen on the surface. The smell was stronger here, acrid, metallic. And now he was almost certain. The color, the odor, the type of corrosion, these were all consistent with arsenate solutions, probably copper arsenate or lead arsenate. Highly toxic, especially with prolonged exposure. He looked at the children working nearby. They wore no protective gear, no gloves or masks. Their hands were stained dark from the chemicals. When they wiped sweat from their faces, they were transferring those chemicals to their skin. With every breath in this enclosed space, they were inhaling toxic vapors. "How many hours do the children work here each day?" Cross asked. 6 hours with a brief break for a meal. Quite reasonable, I think. 6 hours a day breathing toxic air, handling poisonous substances in an enclosed space with poor ventilation. For children whose smaller bodies would be more susceptible to the effects. Cross felt rage building in his chest, but forced his expression to remain neutral, interested, academic. "And have there been any health issues? I understand some children have been ill recently." Carver's expression flickered. Just for a moment, something cold passed behind his eyes. "Childhood ailments, unfortunately common. Dr. Vaughn attributes it to various fevers. Tragic, but unrelated to their work here. The Chamber of Commerce has investigated and found no concerns." It was a smooth lie, delivered with complete confidence. Cross glanced at Margaret and saw the tightness around her mouth, the anger she was also suppressing. "I see," Cross said. "Well, it's certainly an impressive operation. The efficiency is remarkable." They left the shed a few minutes later, stepping back into the sunshine. Cross breathed deeply, grateful for fresh air, but his mind was already cataloging everything he'd seen. The symptoms Margaret described matched arsenate poisoning perfectly. The children's exposure was constant and unprotected. And Silas Carver either knew exactly what he was doing and didn't care, or was willfully ignorant of the consequences of his innovative methods. Either way, Cross thought grimly, children were dying, and something had to be done. After the tour, Margaret invited Cross to see her classroom, a small building near the workers' quarters that served as the Plantation school. Carver excused himself to attend to business matters, clearly satisfied that he'd impressed his northern visitor. As soon as they were alone in the classroom, Margaret closed the door and turned to Cross with desperate eyes. "Well, did you see what I meant?" Cross set his bag on one of the small desks and pulled out his notebook. "I need to examine the sick children immediately. The situation is worse than your letter suggested. Margaret, those children are being poisoned." "You're certain?" "Nearly certain. The chemical solution Carver is using appears to be some form of arsenate, likely copper or lead arsenate. It's used in industrial applications, and I've seen poisoning cases before. The symptoms match exactly. With the exposure those children are getting, daily for hours in an enclosed space, it's a wonder more haven't died." Margaret sank into a chair, her hand at her throat. "Then Mr. Carver is knowingly—" "I can't prove he knows the extent of the danger. He may have been sold the process as safe, or he may be deliberately ignoring the risks because it's profitable. But the result is the same. Children are dying." Cross closed his notebook. "I need to examine every child who's worked in that shed, document their symptoms, establish a clear pattern. Then we have evidence that can't be dismissed." "How will you do that without revealing yourself? Can you arrange visits to their homes?" "Say, I'm concerned about their educational progress, want to check on those who've been absent from school." Margaret nodded slowly. Yes, that could work. The families trust me, if I vouch for you." She stood, moving to a cabinet where she kept records. "I have a list of all the children who work in the processing shed. 12 of them are currently healthy enough to work. 5 are too sick and have stayed home. And then there are the 5 who've died. I need to speak with the families of the deceased as well. Learn everything I can about the progression of their illness. That will be harder. They're frightened, Harlan. When a child dies and you're powerless to stop it, when you're completely dependent on the man who owns the land you live on, the store where you buy food, the shed where you work, you learn to stay quiet, to not ask questions that might anger those with power over you." Cross understood. He'd seen it during the war and after, the way power dynamics could silence people, make them complicit in their own oppression simply because speaking out meant risking everything. It made him angry, but it also made him more determined. We start with the sick children then, the ones currently ill. If I can help them, if their families see that I genuinely want to help, maybe they'll trust me enough to talk about the others. They spent the next hour planning. Margaret knew each family, their situations, their fears. She advised Cross on how to approach them, what to say, how to build trust. Then she led him to the first cabin. Ruth and Thomas lived in a small structure at the end of one row of cabins. The building was perhaps 12 feet square, with a single room that served as bedroom, kitchen and living space for Ruth, her 3 children, and her elderly mother. The walls were rough wood with gaps that would let in winter wind. The floor was packed dirt. There was a small fireplace for cooking, a table with 3 mismatched chairs, and 2 narrow beds with thin mattresses. Ruth answered Margaret's knock with a baby on her hip and wariness in her eyes. She was perhaps 30, thin and worn, with hands that showed the calluses of hard labor. "Miss Margaret," she said, her eyes moving to Cross with question. "Ruth, this is Mr. Cross, a teacher from Boston who's visiting us. He's concerned about the children who've been absent from school. May we come in to check on Thomas?" Ruth hesitated, then stepped back. "Thomas is sleeping, Miss Margaret. He's been feeling poorly." Inside, the cabin was dim and close with heat. An elderly woman sat in one corner, fanning herself with a piece of folded paper. In one of the beds, a boy lay motionless. Cross approached slowly, keeping his movements non-threatening. "Hello, Thomas. My name is Mr. Cross. Miss Margaret tells me you haven't been feeling well. May I check on you?" The boy opened his eyes. They were dull, unfocused. He nodded slightly. Cross sat on the edge of the bed, pulling his medical bag closer. Under pretense of checking the boy's forehead for fever, he began a systematic examination. Pulse, weak and thready. Temperature, slightly elevated but not high fever. Skin, the pallor was striking, with a grayish tint that was clearly abnormal. He gently took the boy's hand, examining the fingernails, brittle with bluish discoloration at the nail beds and fingertips. "How long have you been feeling sick, Thomas?" "Few weeks, sir." The boy's voice was weak. "Started with just being tired. Now my stomach hurts all the time." "Where exactly does it hurt?" Cross gently pressed on the abdomen, noting the rigidity, the way Thomas flinched. "Here, sir." Thomas pointed to his upper abdomen. Cross continued his examination, checking the boy's eyes, pale conjunctiva, another sign of anemia. He looked at the gums, pale and slightly spongy. He tested reflexes. They were present, but sluggish. Every finding confirmed his suspicions. "Ruth," he said quietly, "has Thomas vomited, had any diarrhea?" She nodded, wringing her hands. "Yes, sir. Nearly every day now. Can't keep much food down. I've been giving him broth like Dr. Vaughan said, but it don't seem to help much." "And he works in the processing shed?" "Yes, sir. Been working there since last November. Mr. Carver, he pays good wages for that work. We need the money, with 3 children and my mama to feed." Cross heard the defensiveness in her voice, the guilt. She knew something was wrong, but was trapped between needing the income and watching her son sicken. "I'm not judging you, Ruth," Cross said gently. "You're doing what you must to survive. But I need to know, does Thomas come home with his hands stained from the work? Does his clothes smell of chemicals?" "Yes, sir. The stains don't wash out no matter how hard I scrub. And the smell." She paused. "It's harsh. Makes my nose burn when I wash his clothes." "Does he ever mention feeling sick while working? Headaches, dizziness, nausea?" Ruth looked at Margaret, then back at Cross. "Sometimes. He says the air in the shed makes him feel strange sometimes, but he keeps working because he's a good boy, wants to help the family." Cross felt the weight of it. This child, barely 9 years old, working 6 hours a day in a toxic environment because his family needed 50 cents a day. knowing he felt sick but pushing through because his mother, his grandmother, his siblings depended on that meager income. "Ruth, I need you to trust me. I'm not just a teacher. I'm a physician, and I think Thomas is very sick because of something in that shed. I think the chemicals they're using are poisoning him and the other children who work there." Ruth's eyes widened. She looked at Margaret, who nodded confirmation. "Can you help him?" Ruth asked, her voice breaking. "Can you make him better?" "I can try. But the most important thing is that he stops working in that shed immediately. No more exposure to those chemicals. But Mr. Carver, he'll be angry if Thomas just stops showing up. He might dismiss us, turn us out." "I'll handle Mr. Carver," Cross said with more confidence than he felt. "Right now, Thomas's life is more important than anything else. Will you keep him home?" Ruth looked at her son, then slowly nodded. "Yes, sir. I'll keep him home." Cross left some basic medicines, bismuth for the stomach upset, iron tonic for the anemia, instructions for forcing fluids. He knew these were only palliatives, that the real treatment was removing the source of poisoning. But it was something. They visited 4 more families that afternoon. The pattern was identical each time. Children who worked in the processing shed, now sick with the same constellation of symptoms. Weakness, abdominal pain, vomiting, the characteristic grey pallor and bluish extremities. Families desperate for help, but terrified of losing their livelihoods. Trust that had to be built slowly, carefully, before they'd speak openly. By the time the sun began to set, Cross had examined 8 children in various stages of arsenic poisoning. He'd documented everything carefully, taking notes that would serve as evidence. But he'd also seen the human cost. The fear in mothers' eyes. The exhaustion of children who should have been playing, but instead lay listlessly in their beds. The grinding poverty that made every decision a calculation of survival. He and Margaret walked back toward the main house in silence, both too overwhelmed to speak immediately. Finally, Margaret said, "What do we do now?" "You have your evidence. What's the next step?" Cross stopped walking and looked back toward the processing shed, its chimney silhouetted against the darkening sky. "I need to get inside that shed again. At night, when no one's there. I need samples of that chemical solution, documentation of exactly what's being used. The examinations prove the children are sick, but I need to prove definitively what's causing it. That's incredibly dangerous. If you're caught, I know. But without that proof, Carver can keep claiming it's just unfortunate coincidence. With it, we can force the authorities to act." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I can get you a key. Sarah, the housekeeper, she's troubled by what's happening. She's kept her own records, seen the pattern. I think she'll help us. Then we do it Sunday, when the shed is empty and Carver is at church in town." "Sunday," Margaret agreed. "God help us." The next 2 days were a delicate dance of deception. Cross continued his role as visiting educator, sitting in on Margaret's classes, meeting with more families, always observed by Carver's watchful eyes. But at night, in his room at the boarding house, he compiled his medical notes into a comprehensive report documenting the pattern of illness among the children who worked in the processing shed. On Saturday evening, Margaret brought someone to meet him at the boarding house, an older black woman with silver hair and intelligent, sad eyes. This was Sarah, the plantation's housekeeper, who had served the Carver family for over 30 years, first as a slave, now as an employee. They met in Cross's small room, speaking in low voices. Sarah sat on the single chair while Cross and Margaret stood. "Miss Margaret says you're trying to help the children," Sarah began without preamble. "Says you're a real doctor, that you think you know what's killing them." "I do," Cross replied, "and I need your help to prove it." Sarah reached into the bag she carried and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. "I've been keeping records. Since the new shed opened last November, wrote down everything I saw, everything I heard." Cross took the journal reverently and began to read by lamplight. Sarah's handwriting was careful and clear, each entry dated and detailed. November 10th, 1869. The new tanks arrived today. Big metal things that took 4 men to carry into the shed. Mr. Carver was excited, said this would change everything. November 15th. The children started working in the shed, 12 of them. Mr. Carver showed them how to handle the seeds, dip them in the solution, lay them out to dry, said they had to be careful, that the chemicals were valuable, but he didn't give them gloves or nothing to protect their hands. November 28th. Little Mary complained her hands hurt. They were stained black, and she said they burned. Her mama washed them, but the stains wouldn't come out. December 20th. Several children looking poorly. Mr. Carver says it's just winter weakness, that they need more food, but they all work in that shed. January 15th, 1870. Mary is very sick now. Can't hold down food. Dr. Vaughn came, said it's fever, but I don't think that's right. Something's wrong. February 3rd. Mary died last night. Her mama is heartbroken. That's the second child gone since December. Both worked in the processing shed. February 12th. I asked Mr. Carver if maybe the chemicals could be making the children sick. He got angry, told me to mind my own business, that I don't understand modern agricultural methods. March 8th. More sick children. James is the worst now. Same symptoms as Mary had, the vomiting, the gray skin, the fingertips turning blue. April 2nd. James died today. I can't keep silent anymore, but who would listen to me? Who would believe an old black woman over Mr. Silas Carver? The entries continued, page after page of careful observation, documenting the gradual realization that something was terribly wrong. Sarah had noted not just the illnesses, but also Carver's responses, his dismissal of concerns, his insistence that the work continue, his anger when questioned. "This is extraordinary documentation," Cross said quietly. "Sarah, you've been recording evidence that could save lives." "Could save lives, or could get me dismissed," Sarah replied. "I'm too old to find other work easy. But I'm also too old to go to my grave knowing I stayed quiet while children died." She looked at him intently. "Miss Margaret says you plan to go into the shed tomorrow, get proof of what's in those tanks. I'm giving you this journal. Use it however you need to, just make it stop." "I will," Cross promised. "But I want you to know, when this comes to light, Carver will know someone gave us access, shared information. There could be consequences." "I know. I'm ready for that." Sarah stood, preparing to leave. "Just promise me one thing, Doctor. Don't let their deaths be for nothing. Don't let those children be forgotten." After Sarah left, Cross and Margaret sat together, the journal between them. Margaret spoke first. "This changes things. With your medical documentation and Sarah's records, we have a complete picture. Even if we can't get samples from the shed, this might be enough." "It might be," Cross agreed. "But I still want to get those samples. Physical evidence that can be analyzed, that proves exactly what's in those tanks. It will be irrefutable. Then we do it tomorrow as planned. Sarah left a key for me. It's a copy of the shed key made last year when they had the locks redone. Mr. Carver doesn't know she kept it." Cross nodded, feeling the weight of what they were about to do. Breaking into the shed was illegal, could result in arrest if they were caught. But children were dying, and sometimes the law moved too slowly to save lives. "Tomorrow then, what time does the family leave for church?" 8 o'clock. They'll be gone until at least 1 in the afternoon. Services are long, and then they usually have Sunday dinner in town. That gives us 5 hours. More than enough time. I'll ride out at 9, meet you near the shed. They finalized the details, then Margaret left for the night. Cross spent the next several hours reading and rereading both his notes and Sarah's journal, preparing himself for what was to come. He fell asleep finally near midnight, the journal still in his hands, and dreamed of children with grey faces and blue fingers reaching out to him from darkness. Sunday morning dawned clear and hot, promising another sweltering day. Cross dressed in old clothes. If they encountered chemicals, he didn't want to ruin his good garments. He packed his medical bag carefully with empty vials for collecting samples, notebooks for documentation, and a basic medical kit in case something went wrong. Mrs. Patterson looked at him oddly as he left the boarding house so early on a Sunday morning, but she said nothing. Cross had learned that she asked few questions, which was why Margaret had recommended this particular establishment. He rode slowly toward Carver Plantation, watching for the family's departure. From a distance concealed in a grove of trees, he saw the elegant carriage pull away from the main house. Silas Carver, his 2 adult children, and what appeared to be an elderly aunt, all dressed in Sunday finery, heading to town for services at the Episcopal Church. Cross waited a full 30 minutes after they disappeared from view, making certain they weren't returning for something forgotten. Then he urged his horse forward, circling around to approach the shed from the direction of the workers' quarters, where he'd be less visible from the main house. Margaret waited where they'd arranged, near a large oak tree that provided some shade. She looked pale but determined. "Any problems?" Cross asked quietly as he dismounted. "No. Sarah's in the main house. She stayed behind, claiming illness, so she's the only one there. She'll watch and warn us if anyone unexpected comes. The workers are all in their quarters, or at their own church services. We should be undisturbed." They approached the shed quickly. The area was eerily quiet. No sounds of work, no voices, just the buzz of insects and the distant call of birds. The shed seemed larger and more ominous in the stillness. Margaret produced the key with shaking hands. It took her 2 tries to get it into the lock, fear making her clumsy. Then the lock turned with a heavy click, and the door swung open. The smell rolled out to meet them, that harsh chemical odor even stronger than Cross remembered. Without the noise and activity of workers, the shed felt like a tomb, dark and close and heavy with threat. Cross lit the lantern he'd brought, casting dancing shadows across the interior. "Stay near the door," he told Margaret. "Keep watch, and if you see anyone coming, call out immediately. I need you to be my eyes while I work." Margaret nodded, positioning herself where she could see both into the shed and out across the grounds. Cross moved deeper into the building, his lantern held high. In the daylight silence, he could examine everything more carefully. The work tables were covered with a fine powder, gray-green in color. He ran his finger through it and examined the residue, definitely metallic, with the characteristic texture of an arsenate compound. He took out a clean handkerchief and carefully collected a sample, folding it and tucking it into a vial. He moved to the drying racks where treated seeds were laid out. They were coated in the same gray-green substance. Another sample collected. Then he approached the tanks. These were the heart of the operation, where the real danger lay. There were 3 of them, each about 4 feet tall and 3 feet in diameter, made of what appeared to be cast iron. The metal was heavily corroded in places, eaten away by whatever chemicals they contained. Cross set down his lantern carefully and opened the lid of the first tank. The odor was overwhelming this close, acrid, metallic, making his eyes water. He forced himself not to breathe deeply, taking shallow breaths through his mouth. The liquid inside was dark, almost black, with a thickness that suggested high concentrations of dissolved solids. An oily sheen covered the surface. Cross took out a glass vial and carefully dipped it into the solution, collecting a sample. His hands were steady despite his racing heart. As he sealed the vial, he noticed something. A barrel near the tanks, partially hidden behind some wooden crates. He moved closer and found it bore a partial label, the writing faded but still partially legible. He made out, "Paris green, copper ace-to-arsenite, poison, handle with protective gear." Paris green. One of the most toxic arsenate compounds known, used as a pesticide and wood preservative. And here it was, being used to treat cotton seeds that children handled with bare hands in an enclosed space with no ventilation for 6 hours a day. Cross felt cold fury settling in his chest. This wasn't ignorance or accident. The label clearly stated the substance was poison, clearly specified protective gear should be used. Carver knew, or should have known, exactly how dangerous this was. He collected samples from all 3 tanks, documented everything in his notebook, made careful sketches of the setup. He was so focused on his work that he almost didn't hear Margaret's urgent whisper, "Harlan, someone's coming." Cross's head snapped up. "Who? The family can't be back yet." "Not the family. Someone on horseback coming fast from the direction of town." Cross grabbed his samples and his bag and moved quickly toward the door. They couldn't be caught here. The consequences would be disastrous. But even as he reached Margaret, he heard the horse arriving, heard the rider dismount. They had seconds to decide. Try to hide inside the shed or face whoever was coming. Cross made a choice. "We don't hide," he said quietly. "We're here with good reason. Let me handle this." The figure that appeared in the doorway blocked out the sunlight, a large man, backlit so his features were initially unclear. Then he stepped forward into the light from Cross's lantern, and Cross recognized him with sinking heart. Silas Carver stood in the doorway, and his face was a mask of cold fury. "I had a feeling," Carver said, his voice dangerously calm. "A feeling that something wasn't right about our visiting teacher. So I didn't go to church this morning. I sent my family ahead and doubled back, watched from a distance, and here you are, breaking into my property, stealing my trade secrets." Cross straightened, refusing to show fear. "I'm not stealing anything, Mr. Carver. I'm gathering evidence that your operations here are killing children." "Evidence?" Carver's laugh was harsh. "You're a trespasser and a thief. The sheriff will be very interested in this." "Then let's call the sheriff," Cross replied. "Let's show him these chemicals you're using. Let's show him the children dying of arsenic poisoning. Let's have a full investigation of your innovative methods." Something shifted in Carver's expression. For a moment, uncertainty flickered behind his eyes. Then it hardened into calculation. "You have no authority here, Dr. Cross. You're a northerner with no standing in Alabama courts. Any evidence you've collected through illegal means would be inadmissible. Any accusations you make would be dismissed as the ravings of a Reconstruction sympathizer trying to undermine legitimate Southern business." Cross felt the truth of this like a blow. Carver was right. The legal system here would not be on his side. "But let's say hypothetically that you did manage to cause problems for me," Carver continued, moving into the shed now, forcing Cross and Margaret to back up. "Let's say your accusations got enough attention that I was forced to close this operation while an investigation proceeded. Do you know what would happen then?" "Children would stop dying," Cross replied. 200 people would lose their livelihoods," Carver corrected. "This plantation employs 200 freed slaves, Dr. Cross. They depend on the wages I pay, meager though you might consider them, to feed their families, to keep roofs over their heads. If I shut down operations, where do they go? What do they do? The economy here is still devastated from the war. There aren't other jobs waiting for them. So you use that dependency to justify poisoning their children? I use that dependency to illustrate the complexity of the situation. You want simple morality, good and evil, right and wrong. But the real world doesn't work that way. Sometimes we have to make difficult choices, accept unfortunate costs for the greater good." Margaret spoke up, her voice shaking with anger. "The unfortunate cost is children's lives, Mr. Carver. There is no greater good that justifies that. Easy to say when it's not your responsibility to keep hundreds of people employed and fed," Carver shot back. Then he turned his attention back to Cross. "But I'm a reasonable man, and I can see that you genuinely believe you're helping. So I'm going to make you an offer. One time only." Cross waited, silent. "Return everything you've taken. The samples, your notes, that journal I know Sarah gave you. In exchange, I'll implement changes. Better ventilation in the shed, shorter work shifts, protective equipment for the children. I'll gradually phase out the Paris green in favor of less toxic alternatives. The deaths will stop, but the plantation continues operating. Everyone keeps their jobs. And you face no consequences for the children you've already killed? Dead children don't come back regardless of what consequences I face," Carver said bluntly. "The question is whether you want to save the ones still alive, or whether you want to pursue justice that may never come, while more children die in the meantime. It was sophisticated manipulation, Cross recognized. Carver was offering a devil's bargain. Justice for practical results, immediate change for letting past crimes go unpunished. And underneath the reasonable words was a threat. Resist, and Carver would use every tool at his disposal to protect himself. Consequences be damned. "I need time to think," Cross said. "You have until tomorrow noon. Meet me at my office with your decision and either the evidence you've collected or a willingness to deal with the consequences of keeping it." Carver stepped aside, gesturing toward the door. "Now get off my property, both of you. Miss Huxley, collect your things from your quarters. Your employment here is terminated." Cross and Margaret rode away from the plantation in heavy silence. When they were safely out of Carver's sight, Margaret spoke. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know," Cross admitted. "He's right about some things. My evidence was obtained illegally. Courts here won't be sympathetic to a northern doctor making accusations against a prominent planter. Even if I could get federal authorities involved, the process would take months, possibly years. And in the meantime, more children could die," Margaret finished. "Or the plantation shuts down and hundreds of families lose everything they have. It's an impossible choice." "No," Margaret said firmly. "It's an immoral choice. Carver's forcing you to choose between justice and pragmatism, between principle and saving lives. But the fact that he's put you in this position doesn't make it your fault." They returned to Montgomery, where Cross shut himself in his boarding house room with the samples he'd collected, Sarah's journal, his medical notes. He spent hours reviewing everything, trying to find some solution that didn't require sacrificing principle or pragmatism. As evening fell, Margaret returned with news. "Thomas is worse. Ruth sent word. He's had severe vomiting all day, can barely stay conscious. She's asking if you can come." Cross grabbed his medical bag immediately. They rode through the dusk back to the plantation, entering through the workers' area where Carver was unlikely to see them. Ruth met them at the door of her cabin, tears streaming down her face. "He's dying, isn't he?" she asked simply. "My boy is dying." Cross examined Thomas quickly. The boy's condition had deteriorated significantly since the last visit. His pulse was thready and irregular, his breathing shallow, his skin cold to the touch. He was barely responsive, his eyes half open but unfocused. "How long has he been like this?" Cross asked, already knowing the answer was too long. "Since this afternoon. He just kept getting worse and worse." Cross did what he could. Tried to start an IV to push fluids, administered cardiac stimulants, attempted to induce vomiting to clear any remaining toxins from the stomach. But he knew, with the terrible certainty that comes from medical experience, that he was too late. The arsenate had done too much damage. Thomas's kidneys were likely failing, his heart struggling, his blood unable to carry enough oxygen. He stayed by the boy's bedside through the night, doing everything medical science of 1870 could offer, which was heartbreakingly little. Margaret stayed too, holding Ruth's hand, offering what comfort she could. In the early hours before dawn, while Ruth had briefly dozed from exhaustion, Thomas opened his eyes. For a moment, they were clear, focused. "Mr. Cross," the boy whispered. "I'm here, Thomas." "Am I gonna die?" The question was so direct, so honest, that Cross felt his throat tighten. He wanted to lie, to offer false hope. But this child deserved truth. "I think so, son. I'm very sorry." Thomas nodded slightly as if he'd already known. "Will you tell my mama? Tell her it wasn't her fault? She blames herself for making me work there." "I'll tell her. But Thomas, it wasn't her fault. She did what she had to do to take care of you." "I know." The boy's eyes were drifting closed again. "Tell Mr. Carver. Tell him." But whatever Thomas wanted to say was lost as he slipped back into unconsciousness. 20 minutes later, with the first light of dawn showing through the cabin's cracks, Thomas took his last breath. Ruth's wail of grief echoed through the workers' quarters. Other women came, offering what comfort they could. The ancient ritual of shared mourning, of community gathering around loss. Cross stood back, feeling the weight of failure crushing down on him. He stepped outside the cabin into the growing light. The sun was rising, indifferent to human suffering. Somewhere in the main house, Silas Carver was likely still asleep, comfortable in his bed, while a child he'd employed lay dead in a cabin barely fit for animals. Cross felt something crystallize inside him. A decision made, not through careful reasoning, but through moral certainty. He would not make a deal with Carver. He would not trade justice for convenience, no matter how pragmatic that might seem. Some things were simply wrong, and no amount of economic justification could make them right. But he also wouldn't wait for the slow wheels of legal justice to turn. He would do something else, something that might cost him everything, but that might actually save lives. He didn't share his plan with Margaret when she emerged from the cabin hours later, didn't tell her what he intended. She deserved deniability if things went wrong. "I'm going to meet with Carver," was all he said. "Tomorrow at noon, like he demanded. And we'll see what happens." Cross spent that final morning making preparations. He wrote a detailed report of everything he'd found, including references to Sarah's journal and his own medical observations. He addressed a package to the Freedmen's Bureau in Montgomery, to the Army Corps of Engineers, to the Federal Marshal. Inside, he placed copies of his notes, samples of the chemicals he'd collected, and a letter explaining the situation in detail. He gave the package to Mrs. Patterson with explicit instructions. "If I don't return by Tuesday, mail this. Not before. If I do return, I'll take it back." Then he rode out to Carver Plantation one last time, arriving at the main house exactly at noon. A servant showed him to Carver's office, a wood-paneled room lined with books and ledgers, a massive desk dominating the space. Carver sat behind the desk, fingers steepled, expression neutral. "Dr. Cross, I'm glad you decided to be reasonable. Do you have what I asked for?" "I do," Cross said. He placed Sarah's journal on the desk, followed by his sample vials, followed by his medical notes. "Everything is here." Carver's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "A wise choice. I'll have my lawyer draw up an agreement." "I'm not finished," Cross interrupted. "I'm giving you these materials because I've realized you're right. Legal proceedings would take too long, might accomplish nothing. So instead, I'm offering you a different arrangement." Carver leaned back, intrigued despite himself. "What arrangement?" "You will immediately cease all use of Paris Green and any other arsenate compounds in your processing operations. You will provide proper ventilation in that shed. You will never employ children under the age of 14 in any processing work. You will provide medical care for all children currently suffering from arsenate poisoning. And you will establish a compensation fund for the families of children who have died. And in exchange, I will remain silent. I won't go to the authorities. I won't publish my findings. I'll return to Boston and you'll never hear from me again." Carver studied him for a long moment. "You expect me to believe you'll just walk away? After everything you've said about justice, I expect you to understand that I care more about saving living children than punishing you. Sometimes we have to compromise our principles for the greater good. Isn't that what you told me? Using my own words against me. Clever." Carver stood and moved to the window, looking out over his plantation. "And how would I know you'd keep your word? That you wouldn't take my agreement and still report me? You wouldn't know," Cross admitted. "You'd have to trust that I'm a man of my word, just as I'd have to trust that you'd actually implement the changes you promise." The room was silent except for the ticking of a large clock on the wall. Finally, Carver turned back. "Very well. I agree to your terms. The changes will begin immediately." He put it in writing, a letter outlining every commitment you're making. Carver's eyes narrowed. "You said you'd remain silent." "I will. But I need documentation. Not for the authorities, for myself. Proof that we had this agreement in case you ever try to claim otherwise." Carver hesitated, then moved to his desk and pulled out paper. For the next 30 minutes, they negotiated the exact wording of the agreement. When it was finished, Carver signed it with a flourish. "There, our bargain is sealed." He held out his hand for Cross to shake. Cross looked at the offered hand for a long moment, then shook it, feeling the weight of what he was agreeing to. remaining silent while a man who'd caused children's deaths faced no legal consequences, trusting promises from someone who'd shown he valued profit over lives, but also possibly saving the children who were still alive, still working in that shed. "I'll be leaving Alabama tomorrow," Cross said, "but I'll be checking on this plantation. I have contacts who will report to me. If I find you've violated any part of this agreement, our deal is void, and everything I know goes directly to federal authorities." "Understood. And Cross, get out of Alabama. You're not welcome here." Cross left the office, carrying nothing. He'd left all his evidence with Carver, as agreed. He mounted his horse and rode slowly away from the plantation, not looking back. But he didn't ride toward Montgomery. Instead, he circled around through the woods to the workers' quarters, where Margaret was waiting as they'd arranged. "Did you do it?" she asked. "I did. But Margaret, you need to leave Alabama too. Tonight. Go back to Philadelphia. Carver knows you helped me, and I don't trust what he might do once I'm gone. What about you?" "I'll be leaving too. But I have one more thing to do first. The official documentation about what happened next is sparse and contradictory. Here is what can be verified. On May 23, 1870, Dr. Harlan Cross was seen leaving Carver Plantation at approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Multiple witnesses observed him riding his horse toward the main road. He appeared calm and unhurried. At 3 o'clock that same afternoon, one of Carver's workers found an abandoned medical bag on the side of the road, approximately 1 mile from the plantation. The bag was open, its contents scattered. But there was no sign of Dr. Cross or his horse. At 5 o'clock, Margaret Huxley arrived at the Montgomery Sheriff's Office to report that Dr. Cross was missing. She stated that he'd been supposed to meet her at her boarding house at 4 o'clock, but never arrived. She was worried something had happened to him. A search was organized. They found Cross's horse 2 days later, grazing peacefully in a field 5 miles away, still saddled. But of Cross himself, there was no trace. The investigation continued for 2 weeks. Theories abounded. He'd been attacked by bandits, he'd fallen into the river and drowned, he'd simply abandoned his possessions and fled back north under an assumed name. Some suggested foul play, looking meaningfully at Silas Carver, but there was no evidence, and Carver had an ironclad alibi. He'd been meeting with his lawyer in Montgomery at the time Cross disappeared, with multiple witnesses to confirm it. Margaret Huxley left Alabama 3 days after Cross's disappearance. She boarded a train north, carrying only a small case, and was never seen in Montgomery again. Sarah remained at Carver Plantation, but those who knew her said she seemed to age overnight, becoming quiet and withdrawn. She continued her work, but stopped keeping her detailed journal. Whatever she knew or suspected, she kept to herself. Interestingly, changes did begin appearing at the plantation in the weeks following Cross's disappearance. The processing shed was thoroughly ventilated. New windows were cut. Fans were installed. Work shifts were shortened. Children under 14 were reassigned to other tasks. And gradually, over the course of the summer, the use of Paris green was phased out in favor of other preservation methods. The deaths stopped. The children who'd been sick began, slowly, to recover. No official explanation was ever given for the changes, and Silas Carver never publicly acknowledged that there had been any problem with his previous methods. In June 1870, a letter arrived at the Freedmen's Bureau in Montgomery. It was unsigned, but contained detailed documentation of health and safety violations at Carver Plantation. An investigation was opened, but Carver was able to demonstrate that he'd already corrected all the issues mentioned in the letter. The matter was closed with no charges filed. In late June, a package addressed to Dr. Harlan Cross was returned to sender from his Boston address, marked Recipient Unknown. The package had originated from Montgomery and contained a legal document, the agreement Cross had negotiated with Carver, along with a note in handwriting no one could identify. The note said only, "The work continues. The children are safe." Let that be enough. Years passed. The story of the disappeared doctor became one of those local mysteries that people speculated about but never solved. Some said Carver had him killed and buried somewhere on the vast plantation. Others insisted Cross had staged his own disappearance, possibly to start a new life somewhere else. A few romantics suggested he'd fallen in love with Margaret Huxley, and they'd run away together to start over where no one knew them. The truth, whatever it was, remained buried. Silas Carver lived until 1889, dying of a heart attack at age 68. He was buried with honors, remembered as a successful businessman and landowner. His obituary made no mention of dead children or unsafe working conditions. History, as written by those in power, was kind to him. But there were other records, kept by other people, that told different stories. Ruth, Thomas's mother, remained at Carver Plantation for 3 more years before moving to Montgomery, where she found work as a laundress. She lived until 1914, and in her final years, she often spoke about the doctor who came from the north and tried to help us. She never mentioned Cross's name. Perhaps she'd forgotten it, or perhaps she'd deliberately chosen not to remember, protecting him even in memory. "He did something important," she would say to her grandchildren. "Don't know exactly what, but after he came, things got better. The shed got safer. Children stopped dying. Sometimes that's all we can ask for, that someone tried, and that it made a difference." Sarah's story had a stranger ending. She remained at Carver Plantation until 1912, when she died at the age of 76. On her deathbed, attended by family members, she reportedly spoke at length, though her words were often confused and difficult to understand. But several people present swore she kept repeating, "He knew," and had to disappear, and couldn't stay. They'd have killed him too. When asked who she was talking about, she apparently looked directly at one of her daughters and said, clear as day, "The doctor." He understood. Some fights you can't win in the light, had to go into the shadows to keep fighting. What she meant by that no one could explain. And Sarah, exhausted by the effort of speaking, closed her eyes and died within the hour. Margaret Huxley never returned to Alabama. Records show she lived a quiet life in Philadelphia, teaching at a school for freedmen's children. She never married, never sought public attention. In 1895, she published a small book of essays about education and social reform. One essay, titled "The Cost of Compromise," examined the moral complexities of choosing between principle and practical results, between pursuing justice through proper channels that might fail, and accepting imperfect solutions that might save lives. The essay never mentioned Carver Plantation or Dr. Cross by name, but those who knew her story recognized the references. She wrote, "Sometimes the greatest sacrifices are those made in silence. The reformer who speaks publicly and is martyred for their cause becomes a hero, remembered by history. But what of those who work in shadows, who make compromises that stain their souls in order to achieve results that save lives? These people are often forgotten, or worse, condemned by those who don't understand that sometimes survival requires us to dirty our hands with deals we'd prefer not to make. I knew such a person once. I don't know what became of them. But I know that because of choices they made, choices I might not fully understand even now, children lived who otherwise would have died. Is that not its own form of heroism? What really happened to Dr. Harlan Cross? The question haunted the few people who knew the full story and lived long enough to reflect on it. Was he murdered by Carver or Carver's agents, his body hidden so well it was never found? This seemed most likely to many. A northern doctor who threatened a powerful planter's interests. The motive was clear, the means were available, and the historical record was full of such disappearances. But if he was murdered, why would Carver then implement exactly the reforms Cross had demanded? Why risk drawing attention by making changes that essentially admitted there had been a problem? It made no strategic sense. Did Cross fake his own disappearance, perhaps realizing that remaining in Alabama made him a continued target? Did he scatter his belongings to make it look like foul play, then slip away to start a new life under a different name? This would explain why his body was never found. why there were no further sightings. But it required believing he'd abandon his medical practice, his reputation, his entire life, and never reach out to anyone he knew again. Or was there some third possibility, something more complex that involved the agreement he'd made with Carver, the letter that arrived at the Freedmen's Bureau, the changes that were implemented, and his convenient disappearance that made it impossible for Carver to ever claim Cross had violated their agreement by going public? In 1923, a lawyer in Montgomery who'd been handling the estate of Silas Carver's grandson made an interesting discovery. Among old papers stored in a bank vault was a sealed letter with instructions that it was to be opened only upon the death of the last person involved in the matter of May 1870. Since no one living knew what that referred to, and since all principals involved had been dead for years, the lawyer opened the letter. Inside was a document in Silas Carver's handwriting, dated August 1870, 3 months after Cross's disappearance. It read, "Let the record show that Dr. Arlen Cross came to Alabama with noble intentions and departed having achieved his goals, though not in the manner he anticipated. I initially viewed him as a threat to be eliminated or discredited. I underestimated his dedication and his intelligence. He understood, better than I gave him credit for, that sometimes reform must be purchased at the cost of revolution, that sometimes the reformer must step aside to allow the reform to take root. Our agreement stands, though he is no longer here to hold me to it. I will continue the changes he demanded because, despite myself, I have come to see their wisdom." The loss of workers to illness was hurting productivity more than the cost of safety measures. His disappearance solved a problem for both of us. It removed him from danger, while also removing me from the threat of his testimony. Whether he lives somewhere under a new name, content with what he accomplished, or whether he met some other fate, I do not know, and do not wish to know. Let him remain a mystery, but let it also be recorded that he did more good in his brief time here than most men accomplish in a lifetime, and he did it by understanding when to compromise and when to disappear. The lawyer who found this document didn't know what to make of it. He eventually donated it to the State Historical Society, where it remained largely unnoticed for decades. The children who survived their time in the processing shed, who recovered from their poisoning and grew into adulthood, carried memories that shaped their lives in ways they couldn't always articulate. Lucy, who'd worked in the shed and become sick in April 1870, lived to be 86 years old. In an oral history interview conducted in 1954, she spoke about those days. "I remember a white man came around, said he was a teacher, but acted like a doctor. He had kind eyes. He examined me, told my mama I needed to stop working in that shed. I remember being scared because we needed the money, but he said it didn't matter, that money wouldn't help if I was dead. And then things changed. The shed got new windows. We got different work. I asked my mama what happened, and she just said, 'That doctor, he did something.' I never saw him again after that. Heard he disappeared. But I always wondered if maybe he didn't disappear. Maybe he just left after he fixed what was wrong." Peter, who lost his younger brother to the poisoning, said in a 1948 interview, "My brother died in February 1870. I was working in the same shed and I was getting sick too. I remember thinking I'd die just like my brother. Then this man came, a doctor from up north. He examined me, wrote things down in a book. Few weeks later, everything changed. They moved me out of the shed, gave me different work. I got better. I always thought that doctor saved my life. Heard he vanished, and I always wondered if Mr. Carver had him killed for trying to help us. But then I thought, if Mr. Carver killed him, why would he change the shed like the doctor wanted? Never made sense to me." These testimonies, and others like them, suggest that whatever happened in May 1870, the children involved understood that Cross had been trying to help them, and that his presence, and then his absence, had somehow resulted in their salvation. In 1953, during renovation of an old building in Boston that had once housed medical offices, workers found something peculiar. Behind a false panel in one of the walls was a small cache of items, some medical instruments, a pocket watch engraved with the initials HC, and a journal. The journal was partially damaged by moisture and time, but much of it was still legible. It appeared to be a doctor's personal notes, covering the years 1868 through 1870. The final entries were dated May 1870 and described a trip to Alabama to investigate children's deaths. The last legible entry, dated May 22, 1870, read, "Tomorrow I meet with Carver to finalize our agreement. I have been thinking about what comes after. To stay here is to remain a target, a threat that Carver will always want to eliminate. To return to Boston is to live always looking over my shoulder, wondering if he'll send someone after me. And to go public with what I know, despite our agreement, would be to break my word and possibly trigger the very collapse of the plantation economy that would hurt the people I'm trying to help. I see only one solution, though it requires sacrificing everything I've built. I must disappear completely. Not die. I'm not ready for that, and it serves no purpose. But vanish so thoroughly that I can't be a threat to Carver, can't break our agreement, can't endanger Margaret or Sarah or anyone else who helped me. The work must continue, but I cannot continue to be the face of it. I've made arrangements. There are people who can help someone start over with a new identity, especially in the chaos of reconstruction. It will cost most of what I have saved, but it's the only way. If someone reads this years from now, know this. I did not abandon my principles. I simply came to understand that sometimes the greatest act of reform is to step aside and let the reforms take effect without your presence overshadowing them. Carver will implement changes not because I'm here demanding them, but because I'm gone and can't be accused of breaking our agreement. The children will be safer not because I stayed to watch over them, but because I left and took the controversy with me. History may not remember me kindly, if it remembers me at all. But history's judgment matters less than living children. I go now into obscurity, content with that trade. May God forgive me for the deceptions required, and may the children I tried to save grow old in safety. The journal created brief interest when it was found, but without any definitive proof that it actually belonged to Dr. Harlan Cross, and with all principles long dead, it was eventually filed away in the archives of the Boston Medical Society, where it remains today. Some historians who've examined it believe it's genuine. Others think it's an elaborate hoax created by someone decades after the events it describes. The handwriting has never been conclusively matched to any known sample of Cross's writing, though the medical details and terminology are consistent with a physician of that era. So the mystery remains. Did Dr. Harlan Cross die in Alabama in May 1870, his body hidden so well it was never found? Or did he successfully disappear, creating a new life for himself somewhere else, taking the secret of his survival to his grave? And perhaps more importantly, does it matter? Whether he died or lived under a new name, the result was the same. Children stopped dying at Carver Plantation. Safety reforms were implemented. Lives were saved. Ruth, in one of her final interviews before her death in 1914, was asked directly, "Do you think the doctor is still alive somewhere?" She smiled, a knowing smile that suggested she might have her own theories. Don't know if he's alive in body, but he's alive in what he did. My other children grew up healthy because of the changes that came after he appeared. I got grandchildren now, running around, living their lives. That doctor, dead or alive, disappeared or hiding, he made that possible. Seems to me that's all that really matters. In 1892, a retired school teacher died in Philadelphia at the age of 64. The obituary was brief, noting only that Harold Crossman had taught mathematics at a freedmen's school for 22 years and was survived by no close relatives. A modest funeral was attended by former students and colleagues. Among his personal effects was a locked box, which his landlady donated to charity without opening. The box eventually made its way through several hands before being purchased at an estate sale in 1920 by a collector of medical antiques. Inside the box was a stethoscope, engraved with the initials HAC, several medical instruments from the 1850s, 1860s, and a small leather journal. The journal contained only 2 entries. May 23rd, 1870. Today I become someone else. Harlan Cross must die so the children can live. It is the only way. May 23rd, 1892. 22 years later. I have lived a quiet life under my new name, teaching children of former slaves, trying in small ways to continue the work I started in Alabama. I've never regretted my choice, though I've often mourned the life I left behind. But I learned something in those dark days of May 1870, that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is disappear, to remove themselves from the equation and let their work speak for itself. The children at Carver Plantation lived. That knowledge has sustained me through decades of anonymity. It is enough. Let this record stand as proof that sometimes the greatest heroes are those whose names are forgotten. The collector who found this journal tried to trace Harold Crossman's background, but found very little. He appeared in Philadelphia records in 1870, seemingly from nowhere, with credentials as a teacher that couldn't be fully verified, but were accepted by a school desperate for qualified instructors willing to work with freed slaves. He taught well, lived modestly, and kept mostly to himself. The physical description in his teaching records matched Dr. Harlan Cross's description. The age would have been right, and there was one other detail. Harold Crossman walked with a slight limp in his left leg, which he attributed to an old war injury. Dr. Harlan Cross had served as a Union Army surgeon and had reportedly been injured in 1864 when an artillery shell exploded near his field hospital. He'd walked with a slight limp ever since. Coincidence or proof? The collector eventually donated the box and its contents to the Philadelphia Historical Society, where they remain today. Every few years, a researcher stumbles across them and wonders. Some write papers speculating about the connection. Others dismiss it as wishful thinking. The truth, like so much about Dr. Harlan Cross, remains just beyond reach. In the end, what matters is not whether Harlan Cross died or lived, whether he was murdered or escaped, whether the journal found in Philadelphia was genuine or fabricated. What matters is what happened after that day in May 1870. Children stopped dying at Carver Plantation. Safety measures were implemented that became models for other operations. A pattern of exploitation was interrupted, at least temporarily, in at least one place. It wasn't the sweeping reform that Cross might have hoped for when he first boarded that train to Alabama. It wasn't justice in the fullest sense. Silas Carver never faced legal consequences, never publicly admitted wrongdoing, died wealthy and respected. But children lived who would have died. Families stayed intact who would have been broken. And somewhere, somehow, a man who came seeking justice learned that sometimes we must settle for mercy. Sometimes we must accept that saving lives matters more than punishing those who endangered them. The story of the doctor who disappeared after examining the plantation children is ultimately a story about the complexity of doing good in a world that doesn't always cooperate with our ideals of justice. It's about choosing between perfect principles and imperfect results. It's about understanding when to fight in public and when to work in shadows. It's about the sacrifices required to make real change in systems designed to resist it. And it's about the children, always about the children, the ones who died and were mourned, the ones who survived and carried forward, the ones who never knew how close they came to the same fate until someone intervened. Dr. Harlan Cross, wherever he is now, whatever became of him, saved lives. And in the end, perhaps that's the only obituary that truly matters. The rest is just mystery, piled upon mystery, silence upon silence, questions that time has buried too deep for answers to reach. But on warm May evenings, when the Alabama sun sets red over cotton fields, some people still tell stories about a doctor who came from the north, tried to help, and disappeared. They tell these stories to children and grandchildren, passing down not certainty but memory, not facts but meaning. And sometimes in those stories the doctor doesn't die. He lives on, walking away into the sunset with his work complete, carrying the weight of his choices but content with what he accomplished. He becomes not a victim of violence, but an architect of his own vanishing, understanding that sometimes the greatest gift we can give is our absence, creating space for the change we sparked to take root without us. Whether that's what really happened, no one can say. But it's the story that endures, passed from one generation to another, a reminder that heroism comes in many forms, and that sometimes the heroes we remember most are the ones who made sure we'd never know their full story. Dr. Harlan Cross came to Alabama in the spring of 1870. By summer, he was gone. But the children he tried to save grew old, and their children after them, and their children after that. A cascade of lives that might never have been, if not for choices made in the shadows of history. That legacy, silent and unmeasured, continues still.